I tracked every single dollar that went into and out of 5 beehives for a full year, and the number at the end surprised even me. It wasn't the number I expected walking in. And if you're running a small apiary and telling yourself it basically pays for itself, this video is going to make you actually check. If you want to see the real, unfiltered math behind running a small apiary, not the rounded-off version people post online, hit subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel does every week, starting with this one. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what 5 hives really cost across a full season, what they actually brought in, and the specific number of hives where this stops being a hobby you're quietly subsidizing and starts being something closer to break even. This isn't a guess or an average pulled from a forum post. This is one season, tracked line by line, with every receipt kept. Let's start with the costs almost nobody adds up properly, because they hit hardest in the first few months and then quietly fade into the background of, well, I already own that. 5 complete hive setups, boxes, frames, foundation, bottom boards, covers, ran me right around $900 total, or roughly $180 per hive, using mid-range equipment rather than the cheapest option or the premium cedar builds some suppliers push. Add protective gear, 2 suits, gloves, a smoker, a hive tool, a bee brush, and that's another $220, a cost that gets conveniently forgotten in year 2 math because you don't buy it again, but it absolutely counts in a true first-year number. An extractor, if you're planning to actually harvest and spin honey rather than crush and strain it, adds another $250 to $400, depending on whether you go manual or motorized, and I went manual, landing at $280. Total startup equipment before a single bee arrived, just over $1,400. Here's what almost nobody factors in at this stage, though. The bees themselves aren't free, and they're not one price. I started 3 of the 5 hives from 3-pound packages at $165 each, which gets you a caged queen and a box of loose workers with no drawn comb, no momentum, and a slower build-up curve through spring. The other 2 I started from nukes, small established colonies on 5 frames with a laying queen already working, at $220 each, paying a premium specifically to skip that slow build-up period. That's $495 in packages, plus $440 in nukes, for a combined $935 just to get 5 colonies of bees into 5 empty boxes. Add that to the equipment, and I was sitting at just under $2,350 before spring had even really started, a number that never shows up in the casual beekeeping is cheap conversations that circulate online, because most of those conversations are being had by people 2 or 3 years into an established apiary who've forgotten what year 1 actually costs. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the ongoing costs across the season told a story I genuinely wasn't expecting when I started this tracking experiment. Feed was the single biggest recurring line item, and it wasn't close. Package colonies especially need heavy sugar syrup feeding through spring to help them draw out comb before there's enough natural nectar flow to sustain that growth on their own. And across 5 hives, sugar alone ran me just under $140 for the season, factoring in both the early spring build-up feeding and a fall feeding push to make sure every colony went into winter with enough stores. Pollen patties, used in early spring before natural pollen sources were reliably available, added another $60 across all 5 hives. Mite treatment was the next real cost, and here's the part that surprised me most. It wasn't optional, and skipping it wasn't actually cheaper once you account for what happens if you do. I tested mite levels monthly across all 5 hives starting in June, and by late July, 3 of the 5 colonies were sitting above the treatment threshold. Treatment products across those 3 hives ran a combined $75 for the season, plus the mite testing supplies themselves, alcohol, jars, a scale, which was a one-time $20 cost that'll carry into future years. Compare that $75 to what happens if you skip testing and treatment entirely. Based on what actually happened to Colony 4, which I'll get to in a minute, That $75 was maybe the best money I spent all season. But here's the mid-season mistake that changed my numbers more than anything else, and it's the part of this video worth sticking around for, because it's the exact kind of cost that never makes it into anyone's rosy "look how cheap beekeeping is" post. Colony 4, one of my package starts, came out of a mild winter looking fine in early spring, built up reasonably well through April, and then, sometime in late June, quietly went queenless without me catching it in time. I didn't notice until a routine check in mid-July, by which point the colony had gone weeks without open brood. Workers had started laying unfertilized drone eggs in a doomed attempt to save the colony, and the population had crashed to a fraction of what a healthy colony that size should have been carrying. That colony was, for all practical purposes, dead. Not collapsed and empty, but functionally unsalvageable without a serious, expensive intervention. Fixing it cost $45 for a replacement mated queen. Plus I had to combine what remained of that weakened colony with a stronger one temporarily to give the new queen enough workers to actually protect and support her, which meant that hive produced essentially zero honey for the rest of the season while it rebuilt. The real cost of that one missed inspection wasn't the $45 queen. It was an entire season's honey production from what should have been one of my 5 producing colonies. And if you're pricing your own honey at even $6 a pound, and a healthy hive in a good year might produce 40 to 60 pounds of surplus, that's somewhere in the range of $240 to $360 of honey that colony simply never made, on top of the direct cost of the requeening itself. There's a cost I genuinely almost left out of this tracking entirely, because it doesn't show up on a receipt, and it's the one most beekeeping economics conversations skip completely: time. I logged every hour I spent on these 5 hives across the season, from routine inspections to feeding, mite testing, the requeening intervention, and the extraction and bottling process at the end. And it came to just under 68 hours for the year. If you value that time at even a modest $15 an hour, well below what most of us actually earn doing something else with that time, that's over $1,000 of labor that never appears in any beekeeping budget I've ever seen shared publicly. Nobody's suggesting you should literally bill yourself for enjoying a Saturday morning with your bees, and plenty of that time is genuinely relaxing rather than burdensome. But if you're seriously asking whether this operation pays for itself in a strict financial sense, and you're comparing it to, say, a part-time side gig or freelance work you could be doing with those same 68 hours instead, the honest answer gets considerably less flattering once labor is priced in at all. There's also a cost that doesn't hit in year 1, but absolutely will eventually, and it's worth planning for now rather than being surprised by it later: equipment depreciation and replacement. Wooden frames warp, wax foundation gets chewed up and needs replacing. Boxes need repainting or resealing every few years to survive weather exposure, and hive tools and smokers eventually wear out or get lost. None of that showed up in my numbers this year because everything was brand new, but a realistic ongoing budget should set aside something like $30 to $50 per hive per year just for this kind of wear and tear, which for 5 hives is another $150 to $250 a year that a first-year snapshot like mine simply doesn't capture yet. Stick around, because coming up, I'm going to show you the actual revenue side of this experiment, what 5 hives brought in real dollars, and the number is going to look very different depending on whether you count what I'm about to show you as a cost or as an investment in next year. Now let's talk about what came back in, because this is where a lot of beekeeping economics conversations get quietly dishonest, usually without meaning to. Of my 5 hives, 1 produced no harvestable surplus at all. That's colony 4, the queenless recovery, and 1 produced a genuinely strong crop, coming in at 58 pounds of extracted honey. The other 3 landed in a more typical middle range, between 22 and 34 pounds each. Total harvest across all 5 hives, 161 pounds of honey for the season. Here's the part where the math gets honest, though, because what that honey is actually worth depends entirely on what you do with it. And most beekeepers quietly round this number up in their heads without meaning to mislead anyone. They're just optimistic. If you're selling retail, in small jars, at a farmer's market or through word of mouth, $6 to $8 a pound is a realistic range depending on your area, which would put that 161 pounds at somewhere between roughly $965 and $1,300 in retail revenue. If, and this is a genuinely big if, you actually sell all of it at that price without spending additional money and time on jars, labels, market table fees, or the hours spent standing behind a table on a Saturday morning. A lot of hobbyist beekeepers don't actually sell their honey at retail prices at all. They give a chunk away to family and neighbors, which feels generous and is genuinely lovely. But it's revenue that never actually lands in your pocket, and it needs to be honestly subtracted if you're calculating whether this operation pays for itself in real dollars rather than in goodwill. In my case, being honest about it, I sold about 105 pounds at retail, gave away 26 pounds to family and a couple of neighbors, and kept the remaining 30 pounds for my own household's use. That's the real breakdown almost nobody shares publicly, because I sold 2/3 of my harvest and ate or gave away the rest doesn't sound as impressive as I harvested 161 pounds of honey this year, even though the second statement is technically true and the first one is what actually determines your bank account. Actual honey revenue for the year, $630. It's also worth breaking down where that 105 pounds of retail honey actually sold, because the channel matters almost as much as the price. About 60 pounds went through word-of-mouth sales, directly to neighbors and coworkers, at $8 a pound, with 0 fees attached, since there's no table rental or commission involved. That's the highest margin channel by a wide margin. And it's also the least scalable, since you're limited by how many people in your own circle actually want honey. The remaining 45 pounds went through 2 farmers' market appearances, priced slightly higher at $9 a pound to account for the hassle. But after a $20 table fee per market, and roughly 4 hours of my time standing behind that table each time, the effective net price per pound after fees, before even counting the time, dropped closer to $8.20 anyway. The lesson buried in that comparison is one a lot of new beekeepers don't expect. At small scale, the unglamorous, informal, word-of-mouth sales channel is often just as profitable, dollar for dollar, as the more official feeling farmer's market booth, without any of the setup, teardown, or fee structure attached. Add in a small amount of beeswax rendered from cappings and burr comb, which I sold to a local candle maker for $22, genuinely a rounding error in the grand scheme, but it counts, and total revenue for the entire year across all 5 hives came to $652. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because this is the number most people either never calculate or quietly avoid calculating, and it's the entire reason I started tracking this in the first place. Total costs for the year: startup equipment and bees at just under $2,350, plus ongoing feed, treatment, testing supplies, and the requeening incident, bringing recurring seasonal costs to roughly $360. Total spent, just over $2,700. Total revenue, $652. Net result for year 1 across 5 hives, a loss of just over $2,000. Before you assume that number means beekeeping is simply a bad financial decision, here's the context that actually matters, and it's the reason this number looks completely different in year 2 and beyond. The overwhelming majority of that loss, roughly $1,900 of the $2,350 in startup costs, is equipment and bees that don't need to be bought again. The boxes, the suits, the smoker, the extractor, all of that is now sitting in my garage, fully paid for, ready to be used again next season at 0 additional cost beyond basic maintenance. Strip out that one-time startup investment, and my actual year 1 operating result, recurring costs of $360 against revenue of $652, was genuinely a small profit of just under $300 once the bees and boxes were already in place. That reframes the entire question and it's the actual payoff of everything we've walked through so far. The real question isn't, does beekeeping make money in year one? The honest answer to that, for almost everyone starting from zero, is no, and anyone telling you otherwise is either not counting their startup equipment, giving away most of their harvest without counting the lost revenue, or running enough hives that the economics genuinely shift. The real question is how many years it takes for that one-time $2,300 investment to pay itself back through a few $100s a year in ongoing net profit. And at my current small scale, 5 hives, modest retail sales, a real but not enormous local honey market, that payback period lands somewhere around 7 to 8 years, assuming no more major losses like the queenless colony and no major equipment replacement in between. There's a risk factor sitting underneath this entire 7 to 8 year payback estimate that's worth being honest about, because it's the difference between a plan that works and a plan that gets wiped out by bad luck. Winter colony losses are simply a normal part of beekeeping, and even well-managed apiaries in a lot of regions see somewhere around a 15 to 30% chance of losing any given colony over winter, depending on climate, mite management, and how mild or brutal that particular winter turns out to be. Across 5 hives, that means a real, non-trivial chance of losing at least one colony most years, and each loss costs somewhere between the $165 for a fresh package and the $220 for a nuke to replace, not counting the lost honey production from that hive while it rebuilds. A genuinely honest, multi-year budget needs to treat colony loss the way a business treats bad debt, not as a shocking exception, but as an expected recurring cost that should be built into the average from the start, which stretches that 7 to 8 year payback estimate out further in a bad winter and pulls it back in during a mild one. Here's the number that actually changes that math dramatically, though, and it's worth understanding even if you're not planning to scale up yourself, because it explains why some backyard beekeepers seem to genuinely profit while others quietly bleed money for years. Equipment and infrastructure costs scale far slower than colony count does. Doubling from 5 hives to 10 doesn't double your extractor cost, your smoker cost, or your suit cost. Those stay largely fixed. What scales linearly is your bee and package cost, your feed, and your treatment supplies. But your honey revenue scales linearly too, and often a bit better than linearly once you're producing enough volume to justify things like farmers market booth fees or wholesale relationships with local shops that a 5-hive operation simply can't access. Run the same cost structure at 15 or 20 hives instead of 5, and that one-time equipment cost that took 7 or 8 years to pay back at small scale often pays back within 2 to 3 years instead, simply because the fixed costs are spread across 3 or 4 times the honey production. There's one more lever worth mentioning before we land on the actual number, because honey wasn't the only thing my 5 hives were capable of producing this year. It's simply the only thing I chose to sell. A strong colony that could have made a walkaway split instead of just honey represents a queen and a nuke's worth of bees that, sold locally, often brings in $150 to $200, frequently at a better margin than the honey that same colony's extra population would have produced instead, since splits require no extraction, no jars, and no market table. Some beekeepers in areas with almond, blueberry, or apple orchards nearby also rent colonies out for pollination during bloom season, typically for somewhere between $75 and $200 per hive for a few weeks' placement, an income stream that has nothing to do with honey at all and doesn't compete with your honey harvest for the same bees. I didn't do either of these things this year, focused as I was purely on honey and just getting through year one intact, but it's worth flagging honestly. The $652 in revenue you saw earlier reflects one narrow way to monetize 5 hives, not the ceiling of what 5 hives are actually capable of producing in a season. So here's the actual answer to the question this whole video opened with. 5 hives in a genuine first year cost me just over $2,700 and brought back $652 in honest, counted revenue. A real loss of a bit over $2,000, driven almost entirely by one-time startup costs that won't repeat. Strip those startup costs out, and the ongoing, ownership-only economics of 5 hives were quietly, modestly profitable, to the tune of a few $100s a year. And the single biggest lever that determines whether that modest profit stays modest or becomes something meaningful isn't honey price, or treatment cost, or even how many hives survive winter. It's whether you catch problems like a silently failing queen before they cost you an entire colony's production for the year. Because that one missed inspection in Colony 4 was worth more in lost revenue than every other line item on this entire spreadsheet combined. One honest caveat before you decide to just scale your way to profitability, though. The local honey market isn't infinite, and it's worth being realistic about it before assuming 10 or 20 hives simply multiplies this year's revenue proportionally. My 60 pounds of word-of-mouth honey sold easily because my circle of neighbors and co-workers hadn't already been saturated by another backyard beekeeper doing the same thing. Scale up to 20 hives producing several hundred pounds of surplus honey, and you're no longer selling into an underserved niche. You're competing for shelf space and customer attention against every other small producer in your area, often pushing you toward lower wholesale prices or forcing genuine marketing effort that a 5-hive hobby never required. The economics of scale genuinely help on the cost side, the way we just walked through, but they don't automatically help on the revenue side unless your local market can actually absorb the extra honey at a price that still makes sense. If you want to run this same exercise on your own apiary, here's the shortcut. Keep every receipt for a full season: equipment, bees, feed, treatments, and any replacement costs in one place. Then, track every pound of honey by where it actually went: sold at full price, sold at a discount, given away, or kept for yourself, valuing only the first category as real revenue. At the end of the season, subtract total spent from total counted revenue, and separate that result into one-time startup costs versus recurring costs, the same way we just did here. That single calculation will tell you, more honestly than any general advice online, whether your own apiary is quietly profitable, break even, or still paying down its first year, and roughly how many seasons it'll take to find out. Let's lock in the big takeaways. First, the real first-year cost of a small apiary is almost always a loss once you honestly count startup equipment, and anyone claiming otherwise is usually leaving something out of their math, often without realizing it. Second, honey you give away or eat yourself is real, valuable honey, but it's not revenue, and conflating the two is the single most common way beekeepers convince themselves their hobby is profitable when it's actually just enjoyable, which is a perfectly fine thing for it to be, as long as you're honest with yourself about which one it is. Third, the equipment you buy once quietly changes the whole equation in year 2, 3, and beyond, which means the real measure of whether beekeeping pays for itself isn't any single year's number. It's the payback period across several years, and that period shrinks fast the moment you scale past a handful of hives. Tell me in the comments, have you ever actually sat down and tracked your own real numbers for a season, costs and all? I want to know if what I found here matches what other backyard beekeepers are actually seeing once they stop rounding up. If this helped you think about your own apiary's numbers more honestly, the next video walks through exactly how I'm restructuring things for year 2 based on everything this tracking taught me. Specifically, the changes that should cut this loss dramatically without needing to add a single new hive. Subscribe if you want it the moment it's up, and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. At the end of the day, this was never really about proving beekeeping is or isn't profitable. It's about knowing your own real numbers instead of running on vibes and optimism. Because the beekeepers who actually make this work long-term aren't the ones who got lucky with a good honey year. They're the ones who know exactly where their money goes and exactly what it takes to turn a genuinely wonderful hobby into something that quietly pays for itself too. And even at a $2,000 loss on paper, watching 5 hives make it through their first full year, feed themselves, defend themselves, and hand back 161 pounds of something you helped make possible is worth more than the spreadsheet will ever fully capture. The numbers just help you make sure you can afford to keep doing it.